NREL for putting this again together. Did it a couple years ago, and it was a great experience, and glad to be a part of it again, and kind of showing you what I've been working on lately. So a lot of this presentation, I'd say probably roughly half of it, is going to sound like the previous presentation. There are some slight differences that I hope everyone will find interesting. And so, again, it was a big team. We probably had about 10 people working on it across the company. But some of the major players here are Mon Fin Hong. She's my supervisor, and she's in strategic and energy analysis at Black & Veatch. Seema Ghosh is a colleague. Ryan Pleka is our director of renewables. Ryan Liddell is our GIS specialist, and there's me. I'm a renewable energy consultant at Black & Veatch as well. So I'm going to give a brief overview of what motivated this application that we developed. I'm going to dive into some of the outcomes of it, the technical potential, and basing that off of LiDAR analysis. I'm going to dive into how SAM comes into play from a techno-economic standpoint, and then I'm going to jump into how we take those outputs and look at what the actual market penetration and adoption rates would be for distributed solar PV. So this is a chart taken from LBNL, and this is what's driving a lot of utilities to kind of take notice to distributed solar. In previous years, it wasn't a big deal because the prices were high enough that adoption was low enough that you would get very low penetration, and so utilities haven't been too concerned with high adoption, high penetration levels. But recently we've seen these prices getting driven down significantly, and that's causing a higher uptake of PV penetration, as we've seen recently with Hawaii and their higher penetrations, and also notably their goal of being 100% renewable by, I believe, 2045 or 2050. So it's those things that have caused utilities to take notice, because a lot of their revenue is taken in from the cell electricity and kilowatt hour cells. So that's been the concern of late, and that's also brought into light this notion of the utility death spiral. And that's what motivated this whole project was, is there a way to actually model the utility death spiral? As utilities lose revenue from higher penetrations of distributed PV, the thought is that that's going to cross a cross-subsidy to those who don't have PV, because the infrastructure still needs to be put in place, and so those costs are sunk. So the thought is that they'll raise prices, and as you raise prices, that's just going to incent people to adopt more PV, and therefore they lose more sales, and it's a negative feedback loop until supposedly they go out of business. Everyone defects. So a lot of utilities have knee-jerk reactions, like we're seeing in Arizona. People proposing to just raise fixed charges as a way to address it. And we believe that rather than, we developed a tool that will help them understand this supposed death spiral so that they can be reactive. And we kind of coined it flipping the DG equation, so that they can go in there and understand the right price signals to send to customers, be them regional type of, more regionally based type of rate structures, and more kind of time of use or more hourly real-time pricing that they could send out there to send right price signals. So the way we tackle this is kind of a three-prong approach. So we have our technical potential, which we did with a GIS LiDAR analysis to assess what you could technically put on rooftops. We have, from that information, we output it into SAM SDK, and that will give us all our economic results on a customer-by-customer basis for all our rooftops in a certain service territory. And then we take those economic outputs and try to understand, just because it makes economic sense, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone's going to adopt PV. There are many other drivers that drive people to adopt PV. And so we run it through some filters to actually understand who's going to adopt and how much is going to get adopted over time. And so the end goal is, once you can understand who's adopting PV and how much through time, you can put that into an IRP planning process. And utilities can then structure programs and incentives to alleviate congestion, defer T&D upgrades, and so on and so forth. Or simply just redesign their rate. So to start, we have our technical potential. Very simply, this is kind of was mentioned the earlier presentation. We get LiDAR data from utilities. We run that through ArcGIS, and we do a lot of processing on that using some of the toolboxes available in ArcGIS to get at a technical potential. And this is kind of the more detailed look at exactly what's going on. So I'll skip this. So the step one is just to isolate the building footprint. So this is a digital elevation model taken from ArcGIS, and it kind of shows you the red hot areas where it's more feasible to place PV. That through another filter where, and just knowing that you have PV is suitable for a certain area doesn't mean it's ideal, and so we look at things such as how much shading does it get, and that's the main driver there. We want to make it contiguous so it can actually be modeled more like a real life, like a PV system that's not just spread out in pixels. And so that's another filter. And then we add some other constraints such as setbacks due to fire codes and accessibility and walkways. So this is all automated through ArcGIS. And we finally get this output, and we run that through our economic potential. And we're using SAM SDK, and we chose SAM SDK because we're looking at hundreds of thousands of customers, so hundreds of thousands of hourly production simulations, and it's very time consuming. So we thought if we could put it into SDK, we could use the power of cloud computing to then get a lot of work done in a little amount of time by parallelizing a lot of that simulation effort. So again, here's kind of the higher level picture of how it all kind of plays together. We get our system characteristics from GIS analysis. We have load data that the utilities usually willing to provide us. If not, we can make assumptions about it. And then we have economic assumptions that we make about different customer segments. We feed that all into SAM, and we get our economic outputs. And so as an example, if I were to do this serially, it would take 32 days, 24/7, to do approximately 640,000 SAM runs. And this number would explode if you're looking at more than just these 4 scenarios. If you wanted to do 10 scenarios, this number explodes. So that's the real power of cloud computing, and that's why we decided to go with the SDK approach. Some other considerations that we weren't, or multifamily dwellings, we didn't look at anything to do with virtual metering or community solar, but that is something that we definitely want to take more consideration with in the future. We pretty much considered tenant-occupied buildings that would have the opportunity to actually opt in to put solar on their rooftop. So the output from everything is this histogram of payback years for a utility that we looked at on Portland, so Portland Gas Electric. And this is what their residential distribution looked like for a couple 100,000 customers. And so we take this and we use that to drive at our achievable potential. So just because, as I mentioned earlier, just because everyone's economic doesn't necessarily mean that everyone's going to adopt. And so with that distribution of paybacks, we want to understand, okay, given a certain payback, who's actually going to adopt? And so the first step is to understand what could the maximum market potential be. And so we have these curves that are provided from NREL and R.W. Beck. They're based on surveys that basically say, if you have a 5-year payback, how likely are you to adopt? And say 20% of people surveyed said, yes, I would like to adopt. So we pass our distribution through these filters to filter down the technical potential to a more accurate market potential. And this is another way to look at it. I'll just skip through this. These are some examples of how it actually gets calculated. Okay, so knowing the total market potential is not good enough either, because that's assuming that everyone's going to adopt today. So we need to understand how the technology gets adopted through time. And so we use this fast diffusion technology adoption curve, which essentially wherever your start year is, it kind of rolls out that total market adoption into out years. And so you can have different curves depending on your payback. And so your early adopters are going to be down here, and then you have your followers until you get to saturation of your total market potential. And this graph on the left shows what it all looks like at the final end result, the incremental adoption. And so this gives utilities valuable information to understand during what specific years how much incremental adoption they can expect each year, and also the cumulative adoption through time. And we take it a step further. We can also assign different demographic groups and have some factors weighted depending on whether we feel like they're more likely to adopt or less likely to adopt depending on their demographic. And we also know that PV is largely is geographically
Nathan, we appear to have lost your audio at the moment.
Unmuted.
Yeah. And give this to utilities so that they can put in their own results, and they can spatially look around and see where all the hotspots are for customers that are most likely going to adopt PV. And by knowing that, they can also dive down in on specific results and see exactly what that specific customer's likelihood is and what their savings would be on a customer-by-customer basis. And then we can take all those results, all those adoption capacities, spatially distributed, and overlay that with their distribution. And we can then model their distribution and start seeing that, are they going to have any kind of violations, and what kind of mitigation strategies do they need to implement now, or can they defer into the future? And if they, as an example, if they identify that this area is no good, but people there are more likely to adopt, they can then say, okay, we need a larger transformer, we need to reconductor our distribution wires. Okay, so if we have to do that, then we know we need to go back to the PUC, say this is what we need based on this analysis, we want to rate base it. When you rate base it, you're going to want to then go back and revisit your cost of service study. How's that going to change your rates? And then by doing that, you're going to have a whole new set of rates. And we're going to take that whole new set of rates, feed it back into this model all over again, and then re-simulate the customer base and see how everyone reacts to those new rates. So the idea is we want to understand so utilities can see how their reaction to what people are doing and how they're restructuring their rates might cause a runaway effect, and they can then interject in there and make the appropriate changes to prevent that from happening. So with that, not sure if I went over, but open for any questions anyone has. And thank you for tuning in.
Thank you, Nathan. Yeah, we will now open the floor for questions. Give that a few minutes.
Hi, Nathan. Thanks for your presentation. Can you talk a little bit about how you use the SDK and what language and what kind of software built around that?
Yeah, I apologize. I wanted to spend more time on that, but I also wanted to kind of cover the breadth of everything. But yeah, so we have a software development team here, and they're using a platform their application development platform is called Asset 360, and they're using C#, and so that's the main wrapper that they're using for that. And then for integrating with ArcGIS, we're using Python because there is an environment that ArcGIS uses that works with Python as well. So we're using C# and Python to kind of communicate with SDK and on ArcGIS.
Great.
And we haven't had any issues with it. I think that's partly due to we knew early on that using PV-SAM v1, I believe it is, using anything other than PV watts wasn't going to be ideal since there are more parameters to account for. So I completely understand the issues there. So that we knew early on that we didn't want to do that, and we would rather stick with PV watts because it's straightforward, it's simple, it's intuitive, people understand it, and also we don't have to be on the hook for being very specific about anything, such as picking specific manufacturers for modules, inverters that we would apply across the board because we don't actually know. So in that case, it's better to use. We feel it's better to use a generic model such as PV watts.
Nathan, I was curious if your program does any accounting for like a range of values that a user could expect. So like if you give them a certain number for a location, do you also give them a range like plus or minus within, I don't know?
Yeah, so the tool's set up it can take as many scenarios as you want. So a scenario could simply just be setting up bookends for some kind of sensitivity. And so you can play with that all day if you want to show in 2030 if this is the expected high end of PV system costs, this is what it should be, and then do another end and show the low end. Yeah, and you can do that for practically any input that you're interested.
Okay, thank you. Well, I guess that's all the questions that we have. So, Nathan, thank you very much. Oh, wait, looks like one more came in.
So it depends. A lot of this big data analyses depends on the utility. So if we're working for a very cool and progressive utility such as SMUD, they will have everything we need. They'll have
back up just a minute there for people not reading the chat box. The question is, what solar resource data are you using for the model? Sorry to interrupt, Nathan.
Yeah, no worries. Yep, so it depends on our client, and so if we don't have it, we'll defer to either purchasing data from Solar Anywhere or just using Solar Prospector. A lot of times, and the reason why we also like SDKs, we can then just not use PV watts. So a lot of times we have actual PV production data. So we can feed actual PV production data into the model rather than simulating it. And if the utility has that to provide. So the short of it is just depends on the client and what they have.
We had another question come in. Has your team attempted social networking for cross-correlation of potential markets?
Social networking for cross-correlation. I'm not sure I understand the question.
So I think that's the question of, you know, if someone in your neighborhood buys one, and then all the neighbors see it, you know, are they more likely to buy it? And some of those kind of interrelated demographic issues.
Yep, that is currently just our, as of a couple weeks ago, was an idea proposed. So honestly, we don't know really where to go with it. We're just going to start doing some lit reviews and primary research and get a better grip of what that actually means. But our hunch is, based on preliminary analysis and for some utilities we've done, it's highly, highly correlated that there is that effect.
Right. And Nathan, are you guys in contact with Ben Segrin or anyone from the Solar DS eSolar team?
Yeah, Eason while he was there, and then Ben. Basically, we leveraged their help for the market potential and adoption curves. So they were a major factor in helping us get through that piece of it. So that we're very thankful for that.
Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure those connections were active. And can you say roughly, you know, how many utilities you're working with right now on this? Or
yeah, so I can't say specific names, but I already threw out a couple. But yeah, so to date we deployed this tool back in October, and we've had we're currently working with one right now, and we've already done 4 utilities. So 5 total to date. Yeah, so it's gaining a lot of interest because people are really curious about what high penetrations of PV is going to mean to their business. And so we're hoping to help address that.